Hello, Professor Gao. Welcome to our virtual newsroom. Thank you so much for being here with us today. So before we get to the meat of the interview, can I just invite you to introduce yourself a little bit, who you are, what you do, and what's your specialization?
Sure. My name is Henry Gao. I'm a law professor at Singapore Management University. I specialize on trade law issues, especially those relating to China and WTO, which I've been following for the past 20 years. So it's very interesting to see all these latest developments in U.S.-China trade relationship, and I'm glad to share it with everyone today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So, since you mentioned, let's just start by talking a little bit about trade policy in the past years. So I just wanted to invite you to take stock of the Trump administration's China trade policy. How would you assess that policy initiative in general? And what have we learned from its achievements and failures?
Well, I think now that Trump administration is over, we can safely provide a conclusive assessment by saying that the Trump trade policy on China has largely been a failure. And I think there are several lessons that we can learn from the Trump trade policy on China. First one is that trade wars don't work, because when you impose tariffs on products from China, you are also hurting your own economy. As people in the U.S. have seen over the years, basically the prices increase, and also the downstream industries cannot get access to cheaper Chinese inputs, and all these are hurting the U.S. economy. At the same time, it's hurting the Chinese economy. So that is the first lesson. And the second lesson is that unilateralism doesn't work, because if you look at what Trump did, he was basically waging the war against China alone. And at the same time, he was also waging a kind of a mini trade war against his allies, countries like Canada, like EU, like Mexico, Japan, Australia. All suffer from the protectionist trade policies by Trump at some point. When Trump launched these tariffs, for example, on steel and aluminum products and so on. So this greatly undermines the relationship between the U.S. and its allies. So the goodwill between the U.S. and its allies has been greatly damaged during the Trump administration. So at times you see that when the Trump administration wanted to ask the allies to do something, for example, to counter China, the response it was getting was kind of lukewarm. It's unlike the previous administrations. So that's the second lesson on unilateralism. The third lesson is that managed trade doesn't really work. So if you look at the result of the trade war, the so-called Phase 1 agreement between the U.S. and China, which the Trump administration hailed as a great achievement because they got China to agree to purchase a large quantity of U.S. goods and agree to some of the rules issues. Now, if you look at the actual implementation of that agreement, actually, Dr. Chad Bong, a good friend of mine from the Patterson Institute on International Economics, he just published an article on this point by assessing the purchase commitments by China and whether China was able to fulfill these commitments. And his conclusion, by looking at the numbers for the 12 months of 2020, is that China was only able to fulfill 59% of the purchasing targets. So this means that the results, the effect of the Phase 1 deal really is not that great. He discussed more detail in his paper, but basically he compared the scenario without the trade war with the one with the trade war. And the conclusion is that, actually without the trade war, maybe we will see a 20% increase of the U.S. Exports to China and also China's imports from the U.S. Compared to 2017 levels when Trump first became the president. So this deal has many problems, but again, as Dr. Bong has shown, managed trade doesn't really work because the approach it has taken is the wrong approach.
I see. Interesting, because you mentioned the Chad Bowen paper, which I also read closely. I think it's fair to say that the mainstream economists' consensus is that protectionist trade and investment policies won't work, especially in today's world. But I guess, many U.S. companies also have lots of complaints about China's trade practice. There are behaviors they consider as unfair or even predatory by the Chinese government and by Chinese SOEs. So that brought us to the question of what is actually the correct way to tackle those problems. What would be an effective alternative to the Trump administration's trade policy? So what's your take on that front? What will actually work?
Well, I agree with you that China's record in the WTO is far from perfect. I mean, I'm not saying that, China has the best trade policy. China doesn't, make any mistakes in the trade policy. So indeed, you cannot say that of any WTO member, including the U.S., even the U.S. has many protectionist trade policies. But if you look at the effectiveness of the WTO in dealing with China, actually many cases have been brought against China in the WTO on various issues, for example, subsidies, export tax, IP rights, etc. And when China lost the case, if you look at China's compliance record, you can see that China already complies with the report of the panel and WTO appellate body. So my friend, Professor Zhou Wei-Huan from University of New South Wales in Australia, he did a very thorough study of China's compliance with all these cases it has lost in the WTO. And his conclusion is that China's compliance record is comparable to that of major WTO members such as the US and the EU. It's not like China is always the bad boy, don't comply and so on. No, its compliance record is on par with those of the US and the EU. So how should we deal with China then? Well, as I argued in this new paper for the NFAP, the National Foundation for American Policy, I argue that before we think about making new rules against China in the WTO, I mean, there has been so many calls that we need new rules, both in the Trump administration and even in the new Biden administration. I argue that before we do that, we need to step back and examine carefully whether some of the existing rules can be used to deal with China's trade measures. And here, I think the answer, when you look at the existing rules on whether or not they can help to deal with China, the answer is yes. Now, take subsidies rules, for example. As I argued in my paper, people, WTO lawyers, for example, have been arguing that the appellate body jurisprudence on, let's say, public body made it hard for the other WTO members to have recourse against the Chinese subsidies. But I argue in my paper that, look, things are changing because you are not dealing with the static China. While the strategy might not work 5 years ago, but now, with the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP has all these rules which calls for the firms, including both SOEs, state-owned enterprises, and also private firms, to establish party committees and also to enhance the roles of the party in decision making. So with that, I think it would be very easy for the complainant to fulfill the public body requirement by pointing to this and argue that actually the CCP and the Chinese government does have a significant role to play in decision making in all these firms. So with all these latest developments, I think now the time has come to bring the so-called big, bold cases against China, as argued by former WTO appellate body member Professor Jennifer Hillman, who wrote this influential article and argued that we should use the WTO rules, and I fully agree with her. And I think we should be creative in not only try to think of new rules, but also to bring all these cases against China. Now, as to how to conduct the negotiations, I in my paper for the NFAP, I divided the issues that has emerged in the current round of WTO reform into three categories. The first category included issues which are regarded as non-negotiable by China. For example, if you look at China's WTO reform position paper, China stressed the need to respect the members' development models. That means that China is not going to abandon its state capitalism model. So if you want China to, let's say, abolish all its SOEs and get rid of industrial policy, that might be very difficult. So on this issue, I think maybe the WTO reform would not be as productive because China regarded this as the hardcore core interest issues. The second type of the issues which China are willing to engage in, so these include issues such as electronic commerce and investment facilitation. So as you can see in China's latest agreements, such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement or the RCEP, and also China's comprehensive agreement on investment with the EU. You can see that on both of these issues, China is willing to make concessions, contrary to some commentators have argued. For example, on electronic commerce, there are scholars who argue that China would never make commitment on free flow of data, would never make commitment on prohibition on data localization requirements. But I disagree. So I predicted in another paper that I published a year earlier by saying that, look, if you look at China's way of handling this, so long as you allow China to adopt security exceptions to deal with the problems created by free flow data and so on, China would be willing to accept these commitments. And this is confirmed actually by the RCEP. So when it was concluded 2 months ago, I saw that China indeed included commitments on free flow data in the RCEP, for example. So that means that it is possible to reach some sort of agreement with China. And then the third type of issues which a more nuanced approach should be taken. So here, the example I discuss in my paper is the development issue. You know, the U.S., especially under Trump, has been saying that China should not be treated as a development country, should not enjoy all these benefits for development country members in the WTO. But China disagreed. China, in its WTO reform position paper, has been saying that the development country treatment is an entitlement that China would never agree to be deprived of. So that seems to be pretty strong language. But if you read carefully its submission, at the same time, China also said it's willing to take up commitments commensurate with this level of development and economic capability. So that means that China is not saying that because we are a development country, therefore, we are not going to give in on any issue. Instead, China indicated that it could be flexible on some of the issues. So this is something interesting. So you have to differentiate between the political rhetoric and the practical approach China is taking on some of the issues. So this is here where I think the other countries need to differentiate between the political rhetoric and then China's precise positions on specific issues and try to engage China. So in terms of the negotiating techniques, I also made some suggestions in my paper for the NFAP. And my basic suggestions are, first, the proposed rules should be neutral on its face so that it would not be deemed as China-specific or discriminatory against China. So that is because, you know, China has always argued that it has suffered this so-called century of humiliation from the Opium War, you know, from the mid-19th century when China was invaded by all these imperialist powers. So China is very sensitive against discrimination. So if you try to single out China and say, you know, only you, China, would be required to comply with these obligations, no, that's not going to work with China because China would say this is discriminatory. Why not India is required to undertake the same commitment? Why not Brazil? So I think at least on its face, all these rules should be neutral, should not be discriminatory. And second, the negotiations, as I argued in my paper, should not be one-sided with a long list of demands on China. And it's very important for China to get something in return, even if it's just a token. Because, the Chinese culture has this strong concept of a face, right? So unless their face is saved, they will not react very nicely. So here, a suggestion I made is to abandon the non-market economy methodology and dumping investigations because you don't really need this specific methodology. You can achieve the same result by referring to the language on market disruption, which is already contained in the normal anti-dumping rules in the WTO. So, this provision was supposed to expire by 2016, at the end of 2016. But when the time came, neither the US nor the EU abandoned this approach. So China was very angry, and China sued both US and EU in the WTO. Even though China lost that case, but China still is angry that the US and the EU refused to honor the commitments they made at the time of China's WTO accession. So here, I think if the other countries really want to engage China, they could get a lot of goodwill by basically recognizing that this non-market economy methodology has expired, because, as I said, they agreed to that when China acceded to the WTO, and you don't really need that for anti-dumping actions against China. And the third suggestion I made is that it's very important to have a good understanding of China's own reform goals and policy movements. Because these things often provide important insights on what China could agree to. So if you look at the key documents from the CCP, they have made the goal of the reform to have a market play a decisive role in resource allocation, which means that even China itself is concerned with the market distorting effect of SOEs and subsidies. So if you read that, you could say that China is not really so obsessed with the idea of SOEs and subsidy, and you can try to use China's own language to persuade China, look, that if you open up the market, if you introduce more competition, then this would also be very good for your own firm to have a more resilient, growth, and so on. So I think it's very important for the Western policymakers to understand China, to try to talk to the Chinese counterparts in the language that they can understand by referring to all these party documents and government policies. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for that comprehensive introduction to your work. So you spoke of this idea that China and US have been sort of rivals, but also they also interact broadly in the WTO. I remember there was a paper you wrote earlier on China's rise, how it took on the US at the WTO, in which you argue that since China's admission into the WTO in 2001, it actually invested in sort of building trade law capacity to transform itself and also defend itself. And through those measures and implementations, and through China's increased market power in the world, China actually became a serious rival to both the US and the EU. Can you please give us a few examples on how China actually took on the US and EU in the WTO throughout its history in WTO?
Sure. The paper you referred to is a paper I co-authored with Professor Greg Schaefer from University of California, Irvine. So in that paper, we look at how China tried to build up its capacity in trade law in order to take on the US and other members. So these include several aspects. The first aspect is to boost the capacity of the government and the officials. So right after China joined the WTO, the Chinese government hosted a very high-level seminar on WTO law for the provincial level officials. So basically, the attendees of this seminar are the governors at the provincial level. And then this seminar was opened by President Jiang Zemin himself and also Premier Zhu Rongji and other high-level officials also came and gave speeches. And also the seminar taught the governors in very much detail the rules of the WTO so as to help them to understand what these rules are and what are the things that they have to do in order to comply with China's WTO commitments. Actually, I think this is rather unique in the world because very few other countries that I know of also have such high-level seminars to train the officials. So that indicates that the Chinese are very serious about their WTO accession and the WTO obligations and to educate their senior officials. Second, the Chinese government also tried to nurture the capacity of law firms. So you see that the Chinese government, mainly the Ministry of Commerce, but also the Ministry of Justice and so on, organize all these training courses also for lawyers. So these training courses, some of them are held in China, but some of them are held overseas. For example, in the US, they send students from China to Georgetown University, where many leading professors on WTO and trade law taught these students. So that helped the lawyers to beef up their knowledge on WTO law. And also when China was engaged in the WTO cases, either as a main party or as a third party, the Chinese government also deliberately involved these lawyers in WTO cases by asking them to work together with the foreign law firms that China hire in these cases so that they can learn from the foreign law firms on how to litigate WTO cases and how to understand all this WTO case law and also jurisprudence. So that is also very important. And then also many private firms in China and SOEs also invested heavily in WTO capacity building. So for example, they hired specialized personnel who are familiar with trade and WTO law. And also all these trade associations in China are tasked by the local government and also the central government to help the firms when they run into foreign trade remedies actions. For example, if the US start to have anti-dumping investigations against Chinese firms, the trade associations would get organized and they help the firms to fill in the questionnaire, to hire the lawyers, and then to respond in all these cases. So that also helped to boost China's capacity. And last but certainly not least, you saw the capacity building also in the academia. So you see that, for example, the Chinese government started to include WTO law as one of the core subjects in Chinese law schools. So these courses are taught to the law students, and also the law students are encouraged to participate in WTO Moot Court and also to do internships in foreign international organizations, and all this help to boost China's capacity. And and Professor Schiffer argued in that paper that that is the secret formula to China's boosted capacity in WTO law.
I see. So, after we talk about history, I like to sort of look forward to the future a little bit. So now we have the, many names in the Biden cabinet ready. And, I think you mentioned on Twitter that one of the, the picks by USTR, Professor Mark Wu, is actually a good friend of mine. So, in general, when you see those names, how would you assess the capability of the Biden cabinets, in tackling the China challenges that you mentioned? And do you think they will deal with China differently in the Trump administration? And if so, how it will be different in the next 4 years?
Well, I think there are two things which are remarkable about the new appointees to the USTR and also to the Commerce Department and the other relevant departments like Treasury and so on. First of all, these people are highly capable people. They are highly knowledgeable on WTO, and they are real WTO experts like my friend, Professor Mark Wu from Harvard. So they really understand all these issues. And second, they are really multilateralists, so they are not like, for example, Lighthizer, the former USTR, who, even though he was also knowledgeable of the WTO issues, but he was more of a unilateralist and a protectionist because he has been working, to defend the interests of U.S. Firms like steel firms for quite a long time. So I expect to see a lot of change between the Biden administration compared to the Trump administration. First of all, I think the new administration would probably work more with allies like the EU rather than act on a unilateral basis and alienate the allies, because they recognize that, even though as powerful as the US is, the US cannot get things done on its own in the WTO. It needs the assistance and support of its allies. And I think they would definitely try to strengthen that. And second, I think they would probably make more use of existing WTO rules in challenging problematic trade practices by China, because that is, for example, the advice of Professor Hillman and Professor Mark Wu. Also recently, he wrote a paper in which he also mentioned this strategy. So I think we will probably see more cases brought by the US along with its allies against China in the WTO. And the third one, and this one I'm not so sure, but this is my suggestion basically to the new Biden administration. As I argued earlier, I think that they need to engage China more constructively, both at the bilateral level and at the multilateral level in WTO reform negotiations. So they need to understand China's sensitivities. They need to understand on which issues China would be open for negotiation, on which issues they need to work around by looking at China's own priorities and sensitivities. So they need to basically to try to work out solutions with China. On this one, I'm not really so sure, because you get conflicting signals from the new administration where some are saying that China is a very serious challenge or rival of the US, while some are saying that China, we should not deal with it the way the Trump administration has been dealing with China. But I hope that they could take my advice and try to engage China constructively, because only then can they achieve meaningful results vis-a-vis China.
I see. Thank you so much for all the helpful insights. Thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you, Professor Gao. We'll make sure to talk with you later when trade-related issues come up, and I'm sure there will be plenty. Thank you so much.
Sure. You're
Thank
welcome.
You.
Bye.